Hello and welcome to another edition of e-commerce in the news. This edition is March 22. Let's get started. First of all, we want to dive in and talk a little bit about data that we got back from the US government for 2021 looking at marketplaces. And this is a culmination of multiple data sources, but one of the most interesting things about this data is that 67% of all online sales are coming from marketplaces. If you look at the total global commerce, 67% of total global commerce comes from online marketplaces. A lot of folks may not be aware that marketplaces are so key for this really high volume amount of sales. In particular, the top 100 marketplaces accounted for over 90% of global marketplace sales. So there's a very disproportionate kind of capability within each niche. Each of these kind of 100 sites may represent, 1 to 3 sites per niche, something like that, where the kind of key players in a particular niche tend to dominate that space. And the marketplace type of model tends to generate a lot, if not the most volume of any commerce that's going on in most of those spaces. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. And just talk a little bit about how big these marketplaces are. And here you can see this is pretty interesting as well. So the actual average size or median size that we're seeing is around this 250 million to 10 billion, somewhere in that range. But there are some absolute massive sites out there. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at this, and I'm just going to kind of scroll past a few pieces of data here, but you can see that China has the 3 largest sites by gross merchandise value that's passing through their sites. Amazon is number 3, and then eBay is number 5. So really, really interesting data. We're going to put a link to this particular article in the description. Feel free to take a look at it if you want to dig in on your own. Something else that's really interesting about this data source is that you can see there are 2 sites in the US leaders that we're showing here that you may not be familiar with or you may not have used a lot of. So we encourage you to take a look at these and just kind of get yourself kind of familiar with what's growing really quickly in the US and of course globally as well. In China, for example, with the sites that are doing really well in China that you may or may not have heard of and may or may not have seen and visited. In addition to that, the other thing that we wanted to show is that basically, if you take Amazon out of the equation and look at the total growth, you can see that it's a significantly diminished number. And just generally speaking, Amazon is a monster in the US market. Again, as you can kind of see here from the US leaders. So 390 billion for Amazon, 87 billion for eBay, and then the next closest is 32 billion. So very significant kind of exponential differentiation there. The other thing that we'll point out on this is that growth of the fastest growing US marketplaces in 2021 was 55%, and it was a marketplace called Cherish. So again, this is kind of interesting. You can go in and see what they're doing, what's allowing them to grow so quickly. And this can help you to kind of stay on the cutting edge of some of the best practices, not just in marketplace e-commerce, but generally speaking in e-commerce overall. There are a lot of leadership best practices that you're going to see with these marketplaces that you can employ within your site, whether you're operating a marketplace or not. And then again, kind of a continual trend here with mobile. As you get into this kind of scaled up type of environment, a lot of the sales are happening through mobile devices and mobile applications. So if you are looking to really scale your kind of pervasiveness and remove some of the friction, you're going to want to look at how you can get into the hands of your users in a very convenient way. Many times this is going to include mobile. It can be a progressive web app. It can be a responsive implementation. But usually as you get to scale, you're going to end up building out an app and making it a lot easier for your users, something to consider as you go. Okay, so next in the news, we want to talk about how e-commerce growth slowed. Now, this is kind of a clickbait a little bit, because realistically, for it to continue to grow at the rate that it did would be kind of crazy. Here you can see a really nice visual that kind of shows the growth rate. And so you can see that basically in 2020, we had an outlier of 31.8% growth for the year. And then in 2021, it was 14.2. So it kind of came back to a standard that we've seen for growth. Again, being at this kind of growth though is pretty nuts for so long. And it just shows that being in the e-commerce space, in particular, helping retail transition essentially from in-store to online wherever possible, well, this is going to continue to be a huge opportunity well into the future. And so this is kind of the summary of this article. The other thing that we'll note is that the web penetration has stayed at about 19.1%. So it didn't have a lot of change. And if you kind of look at the data, again, we'll link to this article in the description. Feel free to take a look for yourself. But you can see there was just kind of some slowing of the growth relative, again, to 2021. And then if you look at the actual penetration, you can see that the overall e-commerce sales have increased, but so have overall retail sales. And so this concept of penetration of web sales or e-commerce sales versus in-person retail sales, it's basically stayed the same. It's about 19.1% is through e-commerce, whereas the rest is offline sales. So pretty interesting data. You can see that from 2019 to 2020, that penetration dramatically increased. So it went from 15.5 to 19.1, and it held steady in 2021. So we think this is pretty interesting. It just kind of reaffirms that as we reduce the friction and make it easier for folks to buy things that they can online, it's going to be a permanent change for them once they have that new standard that they can achieve. And then finally, wrapping up, we wanted to point out that in Q4 of 21, we had slower growth in e-commerce than we did in retail sales. So this is a pretty interesting piece of data. It's not necessarily indicative of a continual trend, but some of what you may be seeing here is that because of some of the impact of the major growth from the 2020 period, the data may be, it may just relatively speaking be a little bit off. In addition, it's just interesting to see that overall retail sales increased so significantly relative to e-commerce sales, which didn't increase as significantly. We still had a increase in e-commerce sales. So if you take a look at this data, you'll see that there was an increase of about 1.7% in e-commerce sales from Q4 relative to Q3 of 2021. So a 1.7% increase, but again, there was a bigger increase in overall retail sales of 2.5%. So kind of the big takeaway here is that wherever you can within your business, in order to help you to take advantage of the growth of e-commerce and some of the opportunities that will present themselves, you want to be thinking about where you can provide lower friction, more automation and self-service, and the ability to even augment part of your retail process if you have a retail process, or to investigate and review some of the big players out there that are getting a lot more growth than you may or may not be getting. Even if you're one of the fastest growing marketplaces or e-commerce platforms, if you're building that and you have one of the best in the market, why not learn from what other people are doing? It's just a constant, never-ending thing to keep improving and keep iterating. If you are looking to update or iterate on your project and you want to work with someone in person, feel free to reach out to our team. We offer complimentary discovery, and we also have complimentary resources. We welcome you to take advantage of those. We want you to be very successful with your projects. And until next time, we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.